Great, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our presentation on advancing equity through storytelling and community voice. And we're going to be sharing about an approach called creative evaluation and engagement. To get started, Molly and I will introduce ourselves. So if you'll go to the next slide, Molly. So my name is Sully Moreno. I use she, her pronouns, and my consulting practice is called Culture Shift Consulting. I focus on community engagement, so primarily helping my clients reach out to the communities they serve so that their input can influence the programs and strategies that they're developing. And then Molly and I will also share a creative activity that we each enjoy. I mentioned that I too have been making up a lot of songs since my baby was born. I have a song I sing her every night that actually changes daily to reflect the things we did during the day. So I'm going to go with that one for my creative activity. And then I'll pass it to Molly.
Hi, everybody. My name is Molly O'Connor. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a creative evaluation specialist. It's really nice to be in space with all of you. And a creative activity I enjoy, there's so many. I feel like something that's really present for me right now is I was at a community event where there was clay for people to play with. And I just love just playing with clay so much. So that's what comes to mind for me.
Great. So then we'll go ahead and jump into our content. So to start, Molly is going to walk us through what exactly is creative evaluation and engagement.
Awesome. Thanks, Sully. Yeah. So something I'll share before I go to the next slide is, so this presentation, some of you may or may not know, we actually made this presentation for a conference Sully and I attended in Indianapolis, I guess a month ago now. So some of you, I think, were in the room and some of you weren't and missed it. So I'm just seeing all these names coming up. I'm just like, ooh, you're here. It's so exciting. So yeah, so what is creative evaluation and engagement? Well, first, I'll just say, for people who I see in this room who are not evaluators, there might be some terminology I'm going to use that are just like, what are you saying? So I'll try to use not too much jargon, but if there are any words that confuse you, just put it in the chat, ask at the end of the presentation, and we'll do a Q&A. So first I'll say with what is creative evaluation and engagement? First, it's qualitative, which is kind of a data collecting with using words, making sense out of data that's not just numbers. It's art-based and it's community-centered. So, and I always like to name too that it's an approach that is to collect, analyze, and present data. So, and what's also important to say is this is a theory/approach that was developed by Nora Murphy Johnson, who is the president of Inspire to Change. And also the art-based component was fleshed out by her husband, Andy Johnson. And what I'm going to be telling you today is very much their work, but put into practice through a project that Sully and I did. So if there's anything that you're just like, this is so cool, I want to learn more, there's a book of it, and I'll put the book in the chat, or the link to the book in the chat. It's called Creative Evaluation and Engagement Essentials. And you'll see on this slide, there are 4 phases. And what's important to name is that these phases kind of look linear, but they're really meant to be iterative and fluid. So I'll say them in the order they're in, but they don't have to be in this order. So they're the align phase, learn phase, adapt phase, and embody, which I'll be going into more detail in a later slide. But before I go into detail, I just wanted to say that creative evaluation and engagement is multidimensional, which some people are like, what are you talking about? Like, don't go physics on me. Like, I don't get physics. And I'm like, it's all cool. What I wanted to share is that, like I said, creative evaluation and engagement is supposed to be fluid and iterative. And I made a visual, which I'll describe, where there's like this infinity sign where there's the different phases that are kind of color coded. And you can see how there's an arrow that then points, and it shows like the infinity sign getting like squeezed in the middle. And it's just supposed to demonstrate that, you know, two phases sometimes might like overlap, or you might be in more than one at the same time. And then there's an arrow that then shows it squeezing at like a later phase where maybe there's like three phases at once. So I know some people who do evaluation maybe end up doing it more linearly. So I just like to share that when we're talking about what a creative evaluation today, I'll be talking about it in a linear way, but just know that this is a very fluid approach. So with the different phases, these are summaries of them, and of course they can be more broadened. But in general, the align phase is when you review content and context, like you really try to understand the landscape that your evaluation is about. It's really important during the align phase is to build relationships and trust with the community and the client team. And this is also when you make sure you're on the same page, especially with like shared values and goals, making sure you're on the same page with language. And something that's really important with the align phase that's kind of grounded in creative evaluation is guiding principles, which are your values, but in actionable statements. And it's really a nice way to make sure when you're working on a project that instead of just having a goal, you're more based on values. Because when you're doing a creative evaluation, things change. The world, you never know what will be brought up. So instead of having to just change every moment, you have a North Star that are your guiding principles where you go, okay, we know we're still on the right path, even if maybe things have to shift. So that's the align phase. And generally that's the first phase. It's just kind of a nice one to start with to just make sure everyone's grounded. The next phase is the learn phase. And that's when you really begin designing the evaluation. And usually by this point, you have a community advisory team or community members who are hired onto your team to be a part of the dreaming process. And then of course, like the rest of the evaluation. And then this is just where some evaluations you have capacity and money to really be community engaged, and some you don't. And that is just reality. So during the learn phase, this is when you like determine like what you want to know, what are the questions we want answered, and like how we're going to go about answering them. And this is really when art-based methods comes in, though you can use them really anywhere, but classically it's a really nice time when you're trying to collect data. You can use art-based methods to collect data, which we'll give some examples in our how we used art-based methods, and then I can share some resources at the end of the presentation of classes you can take and resources, which one of the teachers is in this room. I saw Maya, so go Maya. So then the next phase is the adapt phase. And this is when you make sense of the data that was collected, you analyze it. And it's really important to derive action and to offer recommendations. And sometimes this can be in one phrase, like a formative evaluation style, which some people who might not know that, it just means when you're collecting data or something, you're trying to like derive action live. You're not just waiting to the end to make recommendations. And then also in the adapt phase, this is when usually a report is drafted, because most evaluations, people still want a traditional report. So the thing that makes creative evaluation kind of is special, in my opinion, is there's this embody phase, which it might sound a little woo-woo, but I just feel like there just needs to be more embodiment in work in our lives in general, and in evaluation especially. So at the end of the project, we take everything that's learned and we play it back. We play it back to the community and the project team. And that's what we call an evocative playback. And an evocative playback is an embodiment technique where data is translated into an artistic performance or exhibition to allow for deeper meaning making. So I just said a lot, and obviously it's okay if some things didn't land, but hopefully in the next part of this presentation, we're going to show how we did this in practice. But before we do that, we have a question for you, which you'll answer in the chat. What is your initial reaction to using art as an evaluation tool? So yeah, take a moment to put in the chat your thoughts. So Allison's excited about the possibilities. Melanie is thinking about imagining youth doing it and open-minded to how it can be done for others. I totally relate to that. Yeah, and Laura said how it can be powerful to engage with complex emotions and problems. That is exactly what this is about. It's true, Sarah mentioned some folks, don't want to be creative in all settings. We can definitely talk about that. Aw, Eva says it seems freeing. This is great. I'm gonna look at your chats more, but I feel like it'd be a good time for me to now move to the next section. Well, actually, there's one more slide that I'll point out. So there's a document I made that I'll also put a link in the chat for it. It's the creative evaluation and engagement process. So I'm gonna put a downloadable link in the chat. The QR code will also take you to the document, and it just shows a visual representation of the process, specifically regarding this project that Sully and I are presenting about today. And then on the back of the page, on page 2, it has some examples of art-based approaches, which if you ever want to geek out about art-based methods and art-based approaches, you can contact me. There's also, again, Uplifting Maya, which Maya, I think your last name is like Leftwick. Sorry, I don't have it memorized, but there's some really cool people to talk to about art-based stuff. So yeah, I'm going to hand it off to Sully, and I'm going to post some links in the chat now that I'm done talking.
Thanks, Molly. So now we're going to talk about putting it into practice. And first, to give a little backstory about how did Molly and I meet and start collaborating. So Molly and I are both part of a community called Community-Centric Fundraising. And it's around how do you make fundraising more about advancing equity versus about pleasing donors. We can put the link to that community in the chat because I think it's a really good resource for people. But so within that community, there's a Slack where Molly created a channel for people who are new to consulting. So I joined that channel when I was exploring becoming a full-time consultant. And through that space, I heard Molly speak about creative evaluation and engagement. And it sounded like for me, it seemed like an approach that took a lot of things that I intuitively felt should be incorporated into community-centric projects, but put it into a framework. And sometimes I feel that speaking about frameworks can help people feel more confident about doing something versus just saying like, hey, I have the sense that this is going to go well. So when I came across a request for proposal for this project with Public Health Seattle and King County, I thought that it seemed like a good opportunity to propose using this approach because I thought it would lend itself really well to the project. So, it's not that I saw a request for proposal that said, I want to do an arts-based evaluation. No, I came across a proposal that said, help us evaluate our procurement methods, which I think doesn't necessarily sound like the most lighthearted or creative topic, but I saw that there could be potential there. So I invited Molly to respond with me to this proposal. So the context is that Public Health Seattle and King County they have a lot of need to work with organizations outside of the government when they're relaying health information to the public. So, for example, as we just lived through the pandemic, there was need to convey information about how to get tested, how to get vaccinated. And in order to have those types of information conveyed to the general public and especially to communities that public health might not have as many inroads with. So communities of color, immigrant communities, people who speak languages other than English, they often work with community-based organizations, which are organizations that are led by the community that they serve. So for example, I think I forgot to say in my intro, I live in Seattle. So here in Seattle, an example of a community-based organization is El Centro de la Raza. It's a social services organization for the Latinx community, and then the leadership of the organization and a lot of the staff are also part of the Latinx community. So Public Health wanted to make sure that they were giving as many opportunities as they could to these community-based organizations because they know it's really important to reach these communities. So they went through a few assessments to determine whether they were indeed doing that. And then King County as a whole has an equity and social justice plan that also steers their different departments to making sure that their contracting opportunities are not just going to large, historically white-led organizations, but also to community-based organizations and smaller organizations. So I'll take us to the next slide. So as I mentioned, Public Health was doing assessments to determine whether they were meeting the goals that they had set for themselves when it came to working with community-based organizations. And they concluded after these assessments that they still had work to do. So they decided to apply for funding to seek external help. And that's where Molly and I come in. On the next slide, I believe we have yes, that's where we come in. So the request for proposal that we responded was called Contracting Equity Consultant. And again, it wasn't specifically seeking arts-based methods. They really just wanted help evaluating how are they currently doing in contracting with community-based organizations and thinking about where there were areas where they could do better. So we put forth our proposal that described how we would use creative evaluation and engagement to do this. And when we were selected, we heard from Public Health that one of the things that really drew them to our proposal was that it incorporated actually asking community-based organizations how they were doing and how they could improve. So even that aspect of let's just ask the people that we want to work with seemed to be something innovative. And it's definitely something that this approach keeps at its center. So then in our previous presentation at the American Evaluation Association, we did hear that people appreciated hearing how much did this cost? And we didn't have this slide for that presentation, but we added it because it seemed to be really helpful for people. So for the project, Public Health had a total budget available of $160,000, and we ended up spending $155,000 over the course of the project. $103,000 of that was for consulting fees. So the work that Molly and I did over the 9 months that this project was operating. And then the remaining portion, 52,000, that was all expenses that primarily went towards community compensation and artist stipends. I think at least half of that, more, I think closer to 30,000 of that was divided between community compensation and artist stipends. But then aside from that, we also wanted to ensure that that language wasn't a barrier for people participating in the process. So we spent on interpretation and translation. And then we had community events as part of the project. So those event costs were also included in this. And these were things like booking venues, getting food for events, general event supplies. So then before I pass it back to Molly, we'll just go over at a high level, how did each of the stages of the creative evaluation and engagement process look like in this project? So again, there's 4 phases: align, learn, adapt, and embody. So for the align phase of this project, we convened a community planning group that helped inform our principles as well as our evaluation question. Then for the learn phase, that's when we gather the input. We hosted 2 community feedback sessions. Then in order to synthesize what we learned from those sessions, we did work with local artists to generate artwork. And then we also created a report that listed the actionable recommendations that we generated from feedback. And lastly, in the embody phase, we hosted a second set of community sessions. This time we called them community loopback sessions to report back what we learned through the process. And now we'll go through each of these in more detail, and Molly will walk us through align and learn.
Thanks, Sully. Yeah, so as Sully mentioned, the align phase, a lot of it was about planning for the creative evaluation, and most of the time was spent with community in 3 separate planning sessions. Though I will name 2, we did spend time getting to know also public health staff, and we did have a core team through public health. So with the align phase, once we had a grounding with public health staff, we invited community members to shape the process. And something that was really cool is we really wanted to build trust and really get to know the folks that we were bringing in. So the individuals that we reached out to, some had already worked with public health before, some hadn't. And we ended up meeting with individuals individually, just to let them know more about the project, for them to ask any questions. And I remember sharing this at the AA presentation, and I just wanted to share it here too, is it was really important meeting people individually, because sometimes it's hard to ask like the core question when you're in a group. And one of the folks we met, really named and wanted to hear, like, can I trust public health? Do they care? Is this worth my time? Is this going to be transactional? And we were able to take in those questions and respond as genuinely as we could. And then also go back to public health and let them know, like, hey, this is what's going on. There was also one meeting where they were like, all right, white woman, tell me like who you are and why I should trust you. And I was like, sweet, let's get real about this. So anyways, highly recommend, if you have time and capacity, to do individual meetings. So in the end, we held a series of 3 meetings, and each one had a significant part to it. So the first one was co-creating our guiding principles, which again are values in actionable statements. The second meeting was about identifying learning areas, and that's kind of like helping us define what is our evaluation question, like what is the route that we're trying to learn. And then the final meeting was very much having the community advisory group committee help us design what the community feedback session would look like. And We ended up using art-based methods throughout these meetings, and I'll share an example shortly. And I also wanted to uplift kind of how we were transparent about the budget that Sully said. We did pay all of the members who attended our meetings. There was 4 people in total, each representing a different community, and we ended up paying them $360 per meeting. So then they ended up getting over $1,000 being on the community advisory board. Yeah. So then the evaluation question that emerged was kind of like what Sully was saying. It's this procurement department that pretty much they contract folks. And there was this issue where the problem was they were hiring people, but they were predominantly larger firms and they were predominantly white owned or led. And they were trying to figure out like, what's the gap? Like, we want to hire folks who aren't just those identities. And from the community advisory board, the question that emerged is like, what does equitable contracting look and feel like? And we really did end up starting with like a really complicated set of questions. And it was the community advisory group that really helped us simplify and get to the root of what we were really trying to figure out. So I'll share in one of the planning meetings, we used an art-based activity, which is called found poetry. And what this ended up being is we had a bunch of materials, like written materials, which one was in English, one was translated into Spanish because we had one Spanish speaker. And we had folks review the written documents, and highlight words that resonated with them. And we had them review the documents with that evaluation question in mind. Like, what does equitable contracting look and feel like? And then like specifically with having a community feedback session, like how could we make it feel welcoming and equitable, stuff like that. So in the end, everyone, wrote their own poem, and we combined the poems into this poem right here, which I'll read, because this ended up helping us really design what our community feedback session looked like. Gathering in a circle, everyone sitting down, let us find a connection and serve people with passion. Talking, hearing community concern, no one believes our opinion. Vulnerable, yet mistrust consumes. In the end, falsehood would reign. Embrace stories in languages with music of hope and welcoming voices, voices that center truth and addresses oppression. Community, lead with your values, sharing power, how equity advocates, everyone building a better future. So it was that poem that really helped us design what the community feedback session would look like, which that is then the next phase, which is the learn phase. And so with the community feedback sessions, we held 2 of them, and one was virtual and one was in person. So you'll see the photos here are the in-person session, and the photos show Sully facilitating at a table, laughing. One photo shows that we brought in a band. Another photo shows me and another co-facilitator facilitating at a table. And then the final photo shows artwork, because we had artists attend the community feedback session to also collect their own data. So in the end, our in-person incorporated art and music. It also had food, and we created space for discussion and individual reflection and a lot of storytelling. And we wanted to hear from people who had worked with public health and people who hadn't. Like, how can we make a contracting process that felt good? And transparency, showing that each participant was paid $150 to attend both the virtual and the in-person. And if they were in person, we had cash, If it was virtual, we offered check or gift card. And then here's another example of an art-based method we used, which was storytelling, which was done virtually and in person during the community feedback session. And for this, we actually made a worksheet that had some prompts that not everyone needed the prompts, but we had people write a story about like imagining what would good contracting feel and look like, and like have them write almost like a fictional story. And a few people wrote like their personal story, but like flipped, like, well, I had this experience that kind of sucked, but it would have been cool if it was like this. So in the end, we took everyone's stories and we compiled it and made a story written by the community about what would good contracting look like and feel like. And that ended up pretty much becoming the recommendations for our report, because so much of what emerged were just very tangible things that public health could do. So here's a quote from an excerpt, which was from a participant that was put into the fictional story that we wrote. So public health builds on our ongoing conversations about how to sustain the work after the contract ends by helping us showcase our work and how it benefited the community. They help us create a concise narrative that we can share with community members and other potential funders. So yeah, that was an art-based method that we used, and just how it was able to be, how art was able to create some tangible actions that we were able to share to public health. And now I'll hand it off to Sully.
So once we had collected our input through the learning sessions, it was time to synthesize it into our recommendations. And we really wanted art to be not just part of the collection, but we wanted it to be part of the output that we created based on what we heard. So as Molly said, we had artists join the community feedback session so that they could hear what people were saying when it comes to what is a contracting process that feels good. And then they created art that reflected what they saw in those spaces. So first I'll talk about how did we select the artist who we were going to work with. So our community planning committee was made up of 4 members, as Molly said. So we worked with the committee to gather recommendations of community artists that they had either enjoyed their work or knew personally. And then we also collected recommendations from public health staff, other public health partners, and then as well as people that I knew from previous projects. So we ended up collecting 13 recommendations, and we wrote to each of those recommended artists to let them know that they had been nominated to be part of this process. And if they were interested, we invited them to respond to a short survey asking them about their art style, their identity, and why they would want to be part of the project. And we really wanted it to be a simple way of signaling their interest. We didn't want to replicate some of the things we heard caused hardships in entering contracts by making it a really complicated application to participate. So of the 13 artists, we ended up hearing back from 8 that they were interested and that they responded to the survey. And then we went back to the community planning committee to present the people who had responded and to make a decision within the committee about who we thought would be a good fit for the project. And then these are the artists that we ended up working with: Sita Vida Ingram, Jake Prendes, Rebecca Rocha, and Toka Valu. 3 of them, Jake, Rebecca, and Toka, are primarily visual artists, and Davida is a conceptual artist. So we also wanted to ensure that we compensated the artists for the value that they were adding to the project. So each artist was paid $5,000 for their participation, and then they received $500 for art supplies. So on the next slide, we have the pieces that the artists ended up creating based on what they heard in the community feedback sessions. And we really feel like these pieces help convey the feelings that people have either around the existing contracting process or what they wanted the feeling to be in the future. So I'll talk a little bit about each of them. On the top right, we have Toka's piece called Fakato Tofu, and it's meant to convey the dichotomy between things that are community-centric and things that are more institutional, I'll say. So he illustrated the more established, larger nonprofits that were receiving funding from public health as this department store type of setting that is organized but is more sterile. And then on the left side, he depicted a community market, and that's where you can see people gathering, and you can see that it's more vibrant and colorful. And then he explained that a fakato tofu is a type of textile that is created in his culture. He is from Tonga, and that the longer the textile is, the more love you have for the person you're giving it to. So he's conveying that the government funds are flowing and showing more love to the larger, more established nonprofits, even though that's not the place where community is saying that they go to for fulfilling their needs. Then on the top right, this is Jake's piece, and it's called Freedom of Speech. And he explained that there's a piece called Freedom of Speech by Norman Rockwell. It's considered like a quintessential classic painting that has a person talking at a community meeting. But in the Norman Rockwell painting, it's a meeting of white men speaking, white men listening. And he wanted to kind of update the painting to be more reflective of the spaces that we wanted to create and with the people that we wanted to see in this space. And for him, it was important to show that it doesn't have to be that we're all in agreement when we're in space together. And he wanted to portray that with the facial expressions of people. But what's important is that that platform is given to express your opinion. And then on the bottom left, Rebecca's piece is called Usar su voz. And Rebecca was really struck by how we were able to communicate or to give a platform to people in the feedback sessions, whether they spoke English or not. We had interpretation in order to invite more people into the conversation. So she saw how when people are able to speak in the language that they feel most comfortable, they are able to provide really valuable knowledge. So she wanted to show how much worth the words of people have by using gold to illustrate the words coming out of the person's mouth. And then lastly, Davida created what she called a dream book. So it's a pocket-sized book that enumerated at a high level the recommendations that came out from the sessions. So we feel like the combination of artwork and the report that we created really helped to both convey the actions that public health needs to take, but also to convey feelings in a way that a report by itself wouldn't have been able to do. And then on the next slide, we have our embody phase. So we had at the end the community loopback session where we relayed back what we heard in the community feedback session. So we had the artists present their pieces, explain the meaning of them, and then we also read the story that Molly referenced about what a contracting process would be like if it felt good. And then it also provided the space for community members to share back how they were receiving this, whether they had questions or whether there was things that they felt like should be dug deeper into in the recommendations provided to public health. We also gave a summary of the overall recommendations. And from some of the comments we got at the evocative playback, we ended up making some final adjustments to the report. And then to wrap up, we have the list of what were the deliverables that came out of this process. On the next slide. So So we had the 4 pieces that were produced by artists and that public health is finding a place to display publicly. But in addition to that, we also produced a final report that listed the tangible recommendations that came out from the community feedback session. And then as a companion to that, Molly made a spreadsheet where public health can track their progress on each of the individual action items. We ended up having over 50 individual action items for them to take on to create a more equitable contracting process. We also, in addition to the evocative playback session, we had a conversation with public health staff about the outcomes of the project, where they also had the chance to ask questions and start to envision themselves putting these recommendations into practice. And like I said, public health is finding a place to publicly display the art that was produced from this project. So before we give our final conclusions, we have one more question for you all to respond in the chat. And then we'll just have quick final thoughts before we open up the space for questions. So our question is, how could you see your clients or organization reacting to a similar process? And by clients, since Molly and I are consultants, that's why we always think of clients. We had people ask us before, like, you mean the people who receive social services? But we mean more like how would your employer react to this process if it's something that you wanted to suggest? So we have our first comment that many of them would find it refreshing, that seeing it in action would be something that would make it easier for people to consider, that you could see pushback. The price tag could cause sticker shock, that it could be seen as a way to bridge gaps that had been present before. Yeah, and I think that we'll touch on some of these things as we give our final thoughts. So I'll move us to that final section of our presentation. And Molly and I are both going to be sharing from our perspective why we think people should consider it. So for me, I specialize in community engagement. The evaluation piece, I was grateful to have Molly as a collaborator to bring that expertise. But when I work on community engagement projects, there are things that I often hear community members say that I feel are really addressed in the creative evaluation and engagement process. First, I often hear community members say, this organization or this government agency wants our opinion, but they're not approaching us in a way that feels comfortable to us. And this can be either because the language that is being used is too technical, or because the spaces where they're being invited just don't feel welcoming to them. And I think that the the creative evaluation and engagement process gives a framework to really intentionally design those things around how you're going to be communicating with the people who you're collecting input from, and how you're designing the space, especially if you are able to work in partnership with community members, as we did to design the community feedback session. And I think that the activities that we were able to incorporate, both arts-based and more just general dialogue, we're able to take all of that technical content and put it in ways that people are more able to relate to. So the contracting process does have a lot of jargon involved in it. And we felt that if we just ask people questions, like, for example, what do you think of the terms and conditions of this contract? It would be hard for them to answer. But instead, if we went and created a storytelling exercise, we would be able to get the insights that we needed more easily, since people would have a better idea of how they would answer those questions. So I do think that, oftentimes I'm in situations where I feel like the client feels there's a gap between what we heard in the community meeting and the questions that they had. And I do see it as our job as consultants and evaluators to help bridge that gap by like translating the community input into things that answer the client's questions. So yeah, I do feel like there's a little bit of process between community meeting and final report. And then I think that the other piece around being in settings that feel welcoming to people, with this process, we were able to put in place the community sessions in a way that that felt that where people felt comfortable being in those spaces. And we did that through things like incorporating music, as was suggested by a community partner. And then in the final session, we actually held it at an art gallery that is co-owned by one of the artists who were part of the project. So it felt like a more vibrant and inviting space. And for instance, if we had brought people into a conference room. So I think that this method really helps accomplish those goals of inviting community into the process. And I'll pass it over to Molly for her perspective.
I think you said it all, Sully. I think the one thing I'll say, which I remember now saying at AEA, and I think it's still true, is for the evaluators that are in the room, a really big takeaway for me was, so like Sully said, Sully, brought me in for that evaluation component. But honestly, now for future projects, because I predominantly like to do community engagement. And now after this project, I'm always going to bring in a community engagement specialist. It was just so important to actually do this work well. And that was my biggest takeaway to this. And obviously what Sully said, I agree with all the art stuff and how it's just so much more, just felt more organic. And yeah, and if you want to do community engagement work, don't do it alone. And please try to engage in community authentically. And if possible, if you have the budget, hire someone who's trained and specialized in community engagement, because at least I can speak for myself as a classically trained evaluator. I was not trained in that. It's a learned skill, but still I'm not a professional at community engagement. So I'm going to go to the next slide because it has some nice quotes from people. And I know Sully really likes the middle one. Sully, do you want to read that one?
Yeah, so this is a quote that came out after our community loopback sessions. And for me, I feel that if I were to measure the success of the project, like just having this quote would feel like this was a successful project, because it really shows that yes, they got, I saw a comment in the chat about, yes, they got like this nice report, but they also got to build these meaningful community relationships. I think that building community relationships should be a stated goal of every project that interacts with community. And I think that this really conveys it. So someone after our loopback session said, "I thank you for sharing space with all the beautiful people with good hearts and passion for the community. Keep going and doing great work from the heart. It is an honor to share space with all of you. Give it your all, onwards." So this gives me the encouragement to continue operating in this way. So yeah, we will now just have our final slide with our contact info. And we also wanted to, if people wanted to continue the conversation for longer than this Q&A, we also wanted to share a way to schedule a follow-up chat with us. I'll put the link in the chat. If you want to have a 30-minute conversation, you can schedule one through this link. And then we can keep the slide up for a couple seconds as people, if you want to jot down the email addresses or the websites. But then the rest of her time is for any questions or comments from you all. And we knew that it would take us probably over 45 minutes to give the presentation, and it did. So that's why we wanted to leave the space open until 12:15 so we wouldn't feel like we were in a rush. I think that's also part of this method, like we can't rush things. So we'll be here until 12:15, but this is the end of the presentation. So I'm going to stop recording before opening for Q&A. And then, yeah, feel free to stay on until 12:15, or if you need to jump earlier, that's totally fine too.